Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the slight, sorry for the time change from 5:35, then a slight delay in starting now. It's the Secretary of State's diary. Always blame the Secretary of State's diary. I'm delighted to have George Eustice here. I'm Anthony Brown, the chair of the APPG on the environment, and we've got the Environment Bill coming back to Parliament after a little delay. So we thought it'd be absolutely worthwhile doing a sort of full discussion about that. I don't know whether one still needs to say this sort of thing anymore, but normal Zoom rules apply, so please keep yourself on mute unless you're talking. We are recording it, and there will be a link to that on the APPG website after the event. And I should just welcome also the Green Alliance and Chris Venables and Holly Rowden, who are now the Secretariat for the APPG and doing a great work. We've got a bit of a sort of forward programme which we're developing, which I'll talk about at the end, so as not to steal time from George. But George Eustice, obviously Secretary of State for the Environment, he's agreed to say a few words about the sort of broad objectives of the Environment Bill and also what's changed since it was last ahead of the House, and then open it up to Q&A. Some people have submitted questions beforehand, so I'll do those. I'll go through those first, but then if you could put your questions in the chat, that would be best. And as I say, should be questions about the Environment Bill rather than any other issues like the national lockdown or whatever else it is that people want to talk about. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to George. Thank you very much for joining us again and giving us some time. So over to you. Tell us about the bill.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. And again, apologies for being a bit late starting. My diary's been a bit packed today. But the Environment Bill resumes its progress through committee stage in the Commons tomorrow. There's been a bit of a pause, obviously, since we started just prior to lockdown, and there's been a number of reasons for that. One is that obviously the coronavirus situation meant that the parliamentary timetable was heavily disrupted for some time, and actually doing committee stage on a large complex bill such as this with some 130 odd clauses is not easily done over Zoom. But there are other reasons as well. Chief among them is we've just we went to consultation in the summer on some of the proposals in the global, the GRI report that was done on the the Global Resource Initiative, which is about forest risk products and policy steps that we can take to prevent deforestation. And we wanted the option to be able to bring clauses through at report stage of the bill, subject to the outcome of that consultation. So there was another reason for that pause, so that if the consultation goes the right way, we've got that option. We have a vehicle to introduce those changes, such as due diligence in the supply chain. And the other reasons were we had a few minor tweaks to the OEP clauses, just to tighten up some of the language there and bring some clarity about the remit and a few points around accountability in that area. And secondly, we'd had quite a lot of discussion about planning reform. You'll be aware that there's a project really across government at the moment to try to simplify and improve the planning process. One of the things that we were considering is whether we should use the Environment Bill to bring forward some changes perhaps to EIA, the environmental impact assessments, and also the strategic environment assessments as well, where our view is that currently there's a lot of process and a lot of paperwork and a lot of time, but actually they don't always add a huge amount to the knowledge about a particular species in a particular area, and are not always properly understood by local authorities anyway. So our basic view was we should try to improve the baseline understanding around species and habitats in a given area so that you can have a simplified EIA process. Now, we had considered whether we should bring that forward in this bill. I should say that we chose not to in the end, simply because I think really it's a change that could be quite complex. I don't like, as a general rule, taking powers in a bill unless we've got a pretty good idea how we intend to use them. So we've chosen instead to probably delay that until the planning bill comes in, which will give us time to consult and then give a more granular description of what we intend to replace it with. So those are the reasons for the delays. The thing I would say is this is it's a big bill, but an incredibly important bill really in the post-EU era, in that it sets out a new governance framework that will replace the EU watchdog function that's existed, with the Commission playing a role, because there'll be a new Office for Environmental Protection performing that role in future. It will replace a lot of the sort of EU targets, although those come across initially in retained EU law. Over time, we very much see the new targets framework that is set out in Chapter 1 of the bill as being what guides policy here in the UK. And we've already started some engagement on what those targets should look like. And then behind that, as well as that governance structure for the management of long-term environmental policy, we've also taken a range of other powers, so including biodiversity net gain, so that we can ensure that in the planning system, we not only replace or mitigate impacts on nature, but we get a net gain in biodiversity and build back greener as we come out of this current situation. There's a whole section on waste and resource efficiency, establishing extended producer responsibility, and paving the way for instance, a deposit return scheme and other such initiatives. And then finally, there's powers as well around areas such as air quality, but also conservation covenants, where we think there could be quite an important role for these, particularly where we end up having land use change. So it's a big bill, lots of areas in there, and I'm pleased to see that it's resuming its passage through the Commons.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that high-level overview and the mention of the measures that you're changing and adjusting. As I said, if people got questions, please do put it in the chat. We've got actually three screens of different speakers here, so if you put up your hand, I won't necessarily see you if you're not on my immediate screen. The first question I've got is actually from Caroline Lucas, the leader of the Green Party, who I do see here. I don't know if you want to ask it directly, Caroline.
Thanks so much, Anthony, and thank you so much to the Secretary of State. My question is on the Office of Environmental Protection, a couple of related questions. When does the Minister expect the OEP to be fully staffed and operational, and how many staff will it have? The bill requires the government to base its new environmental targets on independent expert advice. Can he give some detail on who those experts will be and how they'll be appointed? And then just a question about the gap. I'm still worried about the gap between the end of the transition and the establishment of the OEP. Can he reassure us that there'll be no gap in enforcement powers? Because I understand that while complaints can be made to the Interim Environmental Governance Secretariat, that investigation and enforcement proceedings won't actually start until the OEP is fully established. Can he say if that's right? And then very finally, he said in the second reading that the government was willing to consider good amendments to the bill. Very sadly, I'm not on the bill committee, but I do have some suggestions on how the bill might be improved, and I wonder if you might agree to meet with me to discuss them.
Well, I'm sure, Caroline, you've always got suggestions in these areas. Of course, happy to receive those. On the OEP, the recruitment process for the chair is well underway, and in fact is pretty much in its final round. I anticipate that we will be announcing that the chair of the OEP well before the end of this year. What we will then do, that the bill won't obviously be receiving royal assent now on the time frame we'd originally hoped. You know, the original hope had been that we might even get this with royal assent by the end of the year, but for all the reasons I've said, that's now highly unlikely. Indeed, you know, it probably won't get to the Lords now until around, you know, either the end of this year or obviously early next year. So we think that we will get royal assent probably by July next year, and that's when the OEP would become fully operational. But prior to that, what we will do is give a shadow secretariat to the appointed chair. So there will be an independent chair that's appointed. They will then obviously start the process of appointing the other board members, and will also start the process as well of working out what their strategy should be. They have to draft what their approach and strategy and enforcement strategy will be. That's something that would come fairly early on. And of course, the first really big thing that the OEP would need to do would be to comment on the annual update on the 25-year environment plan, but crucially as well, feed in its views on those targets, which will be set under the Environment Bill in October 2022. So it will be fully operational, fully staffed, fully functional, well before that big crucial task in October 2022 comes to fruition. But in the meantime, it will have a secretariat to do some of those functions. It won't have, of course, at that point have the power to bring litigation, against government, but it would have, the power to obviously process some complaints in those early months, and where it thinks necessary, start a dialogue with government departments in those areas. But of course, there's already, and those will remain in place, and we see lots of it in Defra. There are no shortage of opportunities for people to bring judicial review and so forth if they disagree with things that are going on in the interim. So I think, although obviously the original intention had been to have it fully established by January, I think it's important that people don't exaggerate the consequence of it being there in a kind of shadow form with the secretariat to do that initial setup work with it fully operational from next July.
Thank you very much. So next question I have is from Nicholas Brown of BDP Pitmans. I don't know if I can see Nicholas. I don't know if you want to ask your own question, or I can ask on your behalf.
I am here. Thank you, Anthony. I don't think I need to ask the question. I think Caroline Lucas asked my question perfectly. It's exactly the same point. So thank you for choosing me, Anthony.
Okay, fine. So next I have Ruth Chambers of Greener UK, which is coordinating Environment Group response to this. So Ruth, I don't know if you're, I can see you. Shall I ask? I'll ask the question on your behalf. So Ruth asked, given the delays Environment Bill and similar legislation across the rest of the UK, will the Secretary of State work with his counterparts in the devolved governments to publish a joint or coordinated statements on environmental principles and governance in the interregnum until the new government's arrangements are legally and operationally ready? So slightly touching on the point that Caroline made, but.
Well, obviously, these environmental policy is devolved, and so the bill that we're bringing forward is very much around powers for England. I think there are some exceptions in some areas where we're taking powers UK wide. In terms of environmental principles, we are going to be publishing guidance on those environmental principles that are established in statute in the bill. But I think obviously we'll share that with other devolves and explain to them what we are doing, the approach we're taking and why we're taking it, and try to ensure as far as we can that there are, frameworks and common approaches. But we can't, in this new era that we're in, post leaving the EU, devolution will become stronger than at any point in history, in that there will be new powers that were centralized in Brussels that nobody had any meaningful impact on, that suddenly return to devolved administrations, and where they will have a very high degree of control in policy areas that they didn't previously.
Excellent, thank you. And then last of the pre-submitted questions from Sarah George of ED. So I can't see whether Sarah's there. I'll ask it on her behalf. How will businesses be able to ascertain whether their targets are in line with the new proposed targets of the bill? How is progress on nature will be tracked, given that many areas of the protected status are degraded and as such have not actually been properly protected in line with the past commitments? So there's two questions there.
Yes, so we've started some early engagement with some key stakeholders on the consultation and our initial thinking around the targets, and that's going to be probably published and will go to full consultation sometime in the new year. However, my general view on this is that it makes sense probably to have several targets on each of the 4 areas so that you are tracking everything. And so biodiversity is a good case in point. The bill required you to have at least 1 target. If you had just 1 target on biodiversity, the argument would soon be that, well, it should just be good or favorable condition on protected sites. And if that were your only target, then you would be missing a lot of really important things, such as what about those sites that aren't protected, the farmed landscape, where our whole future agriculture policies aimed at trying to build back biodiversity and wildlife in those areas that aren't yet deemed ready to be protected or have not previously been set as protected. And so I think if you just had 1 target in some of these areas, same could be said of water quality. If the only target you had was good environmental status, you would miss huge amounts of other important work, in that there'd be whole water courses where effectively policymakers would decide there was very little chance of getting them to good environmental status because of the some man-made feature that had been on that waterway from decades gone past. And you might then not put the emphasis you should on reducing diffuse pollution from agriculture or pollution from, mining activities, for instance, the historic mining activities, which can still be a source of certain pollution. So again, I think making sure you've got sufficient range of targets that you are capturing not just the full panoply of problems that can exist in our environment, but also capturing the impact of all of the policies you're bringing to bear to address those, is going to be quite important. So that gives a bit of a flavour of some of the early thinking that we're developing on the targets. And I hope one thing I'd say as well, I hope that moving from a sort of EU system, where as soon as you have a target, it becomes a sort of perpetual litigation risk and an unpredictable litigation risk, to the point that people sometimes fearful of being too ambitious. Once you get a domestic targets regime, it's quite important that we have the reverse, that you've got ambitious, meaningful targets that track all of these areas and that guide a plan, but that don't immediately lead to the endless litigation all over the shop over technicalities or something. So we've got to get to a very different culture where it's good policy and science that drives our policy, and targets are part of that, rather than it being sort of litigation that drives things. And that's been the sort of failure really of the EU system.
The targets will be legally binding, won't they? So there could be litigation about it, but I agree that's obviously you don't want that. Yeah, and I certainly support having multiple targets. I think it's definitely the better way to do it. So going on to the other questions that people have been submitting. So Rachel Savage from the ENDS report says, is the new OEP clause directing it on enforcement a standard clause? NGOs such as Wildlife Trust are adamant it is not. Can you give an example of what form this direction might take?
Well, my understanding is, and it's not for every public body, but for most public bodies, including regulators, there is actually a provision for guidance to be issued about how a public body should perform its function. And we toyed with this because the difficulty at the moment is the bill as drafted literally says that the OEP should design its own enforcement policy, and it should define what it regards to be serious or not serious. And so the danger, if you're not careful, is you've then got a body that itself is unaccountable, that can rewrite its remit without any reference to Parliament. It gives it a sort of unbridled power to change its own function. And that's not really satisfactory either. So what we have in many other areas, and it's what we had actually on the climate change committee, for instance, is a clause where effectively government can give guidance about how it should perform its function. And I think it's important that people don't overreact to this. I've seen some I think over the top concern about what this might mean. Let me be clear, it does not mean at all that the government can intervene in any individual enforcement case. Of course it doesn't. It's about how it approaches its general functions. And if I can give you an example of where I think it'd be inappropriate for the OEP to act, or where you might give guidance, if, for instance, the Environment Agency were to take a particular approach to enforcement, and let's say, for instance, there was a farmer and there'd been an incident on his farm that was a breach, and that on the face of it was caused by negligence. You want the local Environment Agency officer to be able to ascertain what happened. And it might be, let's say, perhaps the farmer suffered a bereavement and was in a bad way. And yes, there'd been a bit of negligence, but it could be remedied. They might actually give an improvement notice, direct him to put it right, return to visit again in 7 days to ensure that it had been done. And they might judge that that's the proportionate action to take. And what you wouldn't want, I think everybody would agree with this, is the OEP, second guessing decisions that a regulator might take of that sort of nature. What the OEP's function should be in this space is to look at whether there are serious, national breaches of the law, and that's how the bill describes it. And somebody needs to define what that means. And we toyed with the idea whether that could be a schedule in the bill that Parliament could debate and decide. But actually that creates lots of problems of its own, and the legal advice on many levels was that that wasn't easy to do. So in the end, what we did, the approach that basically is common with many other such organizations, and that was to simply have a power to issue guidance.
Okay, thank you. That was a very full answer. So Ron McGee of WWF asks, and you mentioned this in your intro, but when will the government publish its response to the final recommendations report of the Global Resource Initiative Task Force? And does it intend to incorporate the task force recommendations on due diligence into the Environment Bill?
So the response to the GRI report, well, I'd like to say imminent, but knowing what these things are like, sometimes I say imminent, and then the next thing is in due course. But it is, it will be shortly. But I don't have a fixed time yet. But I know that it's been drafted and going through its final kind of checks and clearance processes. In terms of the, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, one of the advantages, if you like, of the fact that the Environment Bill has been delayed slightly is we do have a vehicle should that response to the consultation that on this whole area, and there's two things. There's the response to, obviously, to the consultation, and then the wider response to the whole GRI report that had wider proposals as well. But providing that is supportive, then I think we've got the option to add clauses around due diligence at the report stage. So it gives us a vehicle to do that should we wish to.
Excellent, thank you. Now Sarah Whitebread for the RSPB wants to ask a question. If you want to unmute yourself, Sarah.
Thank you, thanks very much. Just firstly, so really welcome the bill coming back. Great news, obviously. Yeah, my question was around the target setting framework and this idea of interim targets as set out in clause 10 of the bill. I mean, really great to see the target setting framework in the first two clauses as you've outlined, Secretary of State. I think what we'd really like to see at RSPB is for those interim targets to also be on a statutory footing, so that we have legally binding interim targets that drive action quickly, because we all know the crisis that's facing nature. And if this bill can kind of do the same thing for nature that the Climate Change Act has done for climate, in terms of those, you know, 5-year kind of reporting milestones that come to Parliament that drive that action, that would be really, really welcome. So will the government consider putting those interim targets on a statutory footing?
I think my view on this is we've already obviously got the Environmental Improvement Plan, which is a 25-year environment plan that the new OEP will have a very important scrutiny role in, which shows, you know, our progress on a whole range of different metrics. And, you know, we've got those interim targets as a stepping stone to the full-blown formal targets that that'll be coming into place in October 2022. Actually isn't that far away. So I think my point would be that you know, it's better to get those, as I said, the set of legally binding targets right, and to have a sufficient number of them that, you know, they're capturing both the full scale of the problem, but also the full impact of all of the interventions that we're bringing to bear. And it's better to get those right and focus our efforts on that, rather than try to rush to make some interim target legally binding, in which case, you know, all that would happen is, because you wouldn't be certain about what policy tools you had to deliver it, you would just have to set something that's unambitious. And I think that's not really what we want the interim targets to do. We want them to be a staging post towards meaningful targets. So I'm not, I don't think is a case really for putting them on a you know, a legally binding footing, but you won't have to wait too long for those other targets to follow. And of course, because we will have an emerging picture by then, because we will be, as I said, consulting in the new year on what the target should be, there'll be a pretty clear idea about the trajectory, the direction of travel, and those interim targets being seen as a stepping stone towards the other targets that we're bringing into place.
Thank you. So I've now got a question from Kiera Books from Friends of the Earth. Can the Secretary of State please outline the process for publishing the Environmental Principles Policy Statement, and tell us what opportunities civil society and Parliament will have to ensure that the statement supports continued strong legal application of the principles, or to challenge it if it does not?
Now I get this again. There's quite a lot of work going on in this area. There is a draft, and we will be, you know, obviously publishing that and inviting views on it. I'm afraid I don't have to my hand a precise timing for that, but I can, you know, reassure you that on this, as in many other areas, my view has been that just because the Environment Bill has slipped somewhat in terms of its timing for a range of reasons that I've explained, that the work for the things we intend to do with the powers under the bill should continue apace. And so right through the last 6 months, with everything else going on, even though the bill has been paused, we've continued frenetically to work to develop that targets consultation, and also to develop our thinking on the environmental principles, and also to progress the recruitment of the chair of the OEP. And that's been a very clear view of mine, which is that we know what we want to do with the powers in the bill, so we should crack on all of those fronts. So I can't give a precise timing for it, but there will be a document on the environmental principles that will be published shortly.
Excellent, thank you. I see quite a few people have just joined us, including quite a few MPs. If you want to ask a question, you can try waving your hand, but I may not be able to see you because we've got over 70 people over 3 different screens. So do please put the questions in the chat, and I'll pick them up, and you can either ask them sort of verbally or I can read them out for you. The next question is from Hattie Owens of Client Earth, picking up on Caroline Lucas's question. What can the Secretary of State tell us about the size of the OEP at the point it becomes operational? Previous government statements indicated it would have 60 to 120 FTEs, full-time personnel. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this is still the case?
Well, we're giving thought at the moment as to precisely what numbers would be needed and when they would be needed as well. And so obviously this is going to be you know, an evolving organization. So I don't think it would make sense to have 120 people suddenly thrown at it from day one. I think there's a, you know, it's always better with these things to for an organization to grow and find its feet rather than to start off with a very, very large staff and have to try to manage that. So I can't give you a precise figure at the moment, but we are giving some thought as to what the starting number of people for the body should be.
Okay, we've got time for quite a few more questions. I say people do ask questions and put them in the chat or way. I've got another question from Rachel Salvage from the ENDS report. That's the second question. Well done, Rachel. So this is about the existing infringement proceedings that the European Commission has on the current EU binding EU targets. What happens to those infringement procedures following the end of the transition period? Many of those cases take many years to come to conclusion. Or does all those infringement proceedings fall away?
I think they end, yes. So the infraction proceedings that the EU brings obviously will fall away, since the European Court of Justice will have no jurisdiction in the UK after the end of December.
Yeah, I think that happens across the entire piece of infringement proceedings.
Yes. You know, however, I should point out here that because of the way in which we brought across, you know, retained EU law, you know, some of that obviously makes reference to text in EU directives, which have also been parked as retained EU law. So there would still, in some circumstances, be, you know, grounds for people to run judicial reviews and so forth on some of that retained EU law.
Right. So I have one question I had about the environment improvement plans. Could you just outline how exactly they'll work and what sort of enforcement mechanism there would be behind them, and who would have the statutory duty to make those improvements?
Well, the approach set out in the bill is that we have to have an environmental improvement plan, and we published a couple of years ago now the 25-year environment plan, which is the first environmental improvement plan. Annually, we give an update on our progress on that plan. It goes through a whole range of different metrics. Many of you will have seen one of these reports. It highlights areas where the data is moving in a positive direction, where it's broadly stable, and also where it's going in decline. And what will be happening in future is that the Office for Environmental Protection and no doubt select committees and others on seeing the publication of that plan will make recommendations, and in some cases potentially, if it's the OEP, take action against government in certain areas. And the government will then have to respond and, you know, give a statement about how it intends to get things back on track. So if you like, the environmental improvement plan is a you know, more granular statement of what is happening on our natural environment across a wide range of different metrics, and it complements the legally binding targets. Although the metrics and progress on each and every one of those metrics is not enshrined in the same way, obviously, as the targets themselves. So the targets themselves are legally binding. You know, the metrics really are a barometer of our overall progress towards improving the environment. And there's a requirement to have such a plan in place, to report on it annually, and for the OEP to scrutinise, you know, our progress.
Okay, thank you. So there's a follow-up question from Caroline Lucas, actually, just on one past question that I did think you didn't quite get to, but about the new targets being based on independent expert advice. Can you say who those experts would be and how they would be appointed? I'm sure there'd be an awful lot of environmental experts who'd be very keen to input into the targets.
Yes, we have looked at that. So we will, and again, we'll be publishing our approach to that. So there are quite a lot of things in this area where there's a lot of planning and thought going into these things, and we'll be publishing our exact approach in due course. You know, we had considered at one point having sort of another, you know, layer, if you like, of formally established committees that would look at these things. But I think we were we were concerned that you might actually then start to exclude some people who had expertise in a given area, and you wouldn't want to be too prescriptive in that regard, because there might be somebody who's the world's greatest expert on fisheries science or something, who happen not to be on the right formal committee, and therefore you wouldn't have access to that knowledge. So, but we will be publishing, in due course, exactly how we intend to do that. But I want to make it as accessible as possible, so that we will consult experts, but also be able to be quite open to people who've got expertise in a particular area coming forward.
Okay, excellent. We've got a question from Elliot at the Wildlife Trusts saying, has the Secretary of State given consideration to including nationally significant infrastructure projects, NSIPs, and other large-scale infrastructure projects into the biodiversity net gain?
Well, this was considered and debated at great length prior to my time, but the view in the end was that when you have these very large nationally significant infrastructure projects, they tend to have very much a life of their own and conditions of their own. They tend to be driven by government just because of the nature of them, and therefore you can require biodiversity gain and mitigation as part of the overall scheme. But the feeling was that because these tend to be quite large, complex projects, that should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and that actually the track record is pretty good in terms of making sure that you do get a mitigation and some gain from some of these projects when it comes to nature and the environment.
Okay, excellent. We've got a question from Richard Benwell about the planning proposal. So, Richard, I don't know, I can't see you here. I assume you're on there if you want to ask the question. Oh, it's down the bottom there.
Thanks, Mr. Brown. One of the exciting ideas in the bill is the idea of local nature recovery strategies, a plan to have mapping out of important areas for the environment around the country and identifying opportunities for improvement. But in the bill at the moment, there's not really a very strong link at all between the local nature recovery strategies and actual day-to-day planning and spending decisions on the ground. So there's a substantial risk that local authorities will invest time and money into these plans that are very shiny and identify all sorts of good projects that are never then implemented because there's no legal link between those plans and actual decisions. It seems like the government's got two chances to remedy that link, either by giving a stronger duty in the bill for local nature recovery strategies to inform local plans, or by including it in the planning reform, planning white paper, which had no reference at all to local nature recovery strategies or the nature recovery network. So it would be good to hear from you, Secretary of State, as to how you think that disconnect between the plans and actual real life planning and spending decisions might be remedied. Yes,
and look, we're open to suggestions, Richard, on this, on this particular front. I think my view has always been that the local nature recovery strategies will sit quite neatly along biodiversity net gain, in that if you look at the hierarchy of objectives, as it were, through biodiversity net gain, the first is that you should try to enhance nature within a particular development, within a site. If that can't be done, if you can't get the full value in that way, well, then it cascades down to supporting other nature projects in the area, in that planning area and the locality. And then if it still can't be done in that way, well, then there probably needs to be some sort of more national sort of credits-based trading system that can be there as the backstop. And I've always felt that really the fact you've got that hierarchy means that the nature recovery strategies won't just be a sort of report that gathers dust on the shelf. They will actually become quite live documents that will drive decisions from planning authorities about where to spend the funds that come from biodiversity net gain. The other thing that we are exploring is whether those nature recovery strategies can also overlap with environmental land management, our future agriculture policy, whether there can be in some areas some overlap with that as well. So I think the crucial thing is making sure that you've got the the policy tools that will provide the funding that makes those recovery strategies mean something, rather than just be a report that everyone says is great but gathers dust. And I think we've got a number of key tools that can ensure that can happen.
Thank you. Got a second question from Ruth Chambers of Prima UK. First of all, just saying thank you for confirming that the policy development on the measures in the bill should continue at pace. Great to hear. Her question is, the process of environmental review is a new one and will need to be ready when the OEP is ready. What engagement is planned with the judiciary, MOJ, court users, civil society to help with this?
Yes, I mean, that's well underway, and we will have in place what's needed. I should point out that that, as I said, there were a few changes made on the OEP, as a number on the call will know. Another one, which is a more technical one that lawyers will understand, that the bill previously in the last Parliament, there was a lot of debate about whether it was better to hear these cases in the High Court, on the grounds that if the government or a government agency is said to have broken the law, well, the High Court's the logical place to hear that, or whether it should be in an environmental review, effectively a sort of first tier tribunal type system. Some advocates of a tribunal system said that it would be a less formal type of approach, and some argued that it might more closely replicate the approach that the ECJ take, although that was disputed. Different lawyers had different views. Others thought that judicial review was the right place to have this, in that if you're going to take the government to court, it should be in the High Court, not in a tribunal that's dealing with sort of someone's benefit appeal one day and then the government sort of breaking national law the next. In the end, because of the muddle that Parliament was in the last Parliament, to square the circle, we ended up with the OEP being able to do either. So take its pick, either do a judicial review or do an environmental review. And just looking at that really in the cold light of day in a new Parliament, it doesn't really make sense to have that sort of twin track approach where you've got two systems, which is only ever a product really of the indecision of the last Parliament. So we've decided that we should just put that beyond doubt and just say, look, if the government breaks the law, the High Court should hear it, and let's be done with it. So yes, there's conversations with the judiciary about making sure that such cases could be heard in the High Court under judicial review principles.
Excellent, thank you. Got a question from Lord Carrington, who I see is on the line here. How will the environmental land management schemes under the Agriculture Bill be coordinated with the policies under the Environment Bill? How do the two fit together?
Well, the environmental land management scheme, which we'll be saying more about, and we've already said will have effectively sort of three key components to it, each with slightly different objectives. But they will connect to many of those targets that we set under the Environment Bill. So if you were to look at, for instance, water quality, then the future agriculture policy will be doing quite a lot around catchment sensitive farming, around soil health, and around reducing diffuse pollution into our watercourses. On air quality, there will be measures to try to reduce ammonia emissions, which is a key pollutant, and agriculture is an important source of that. On biodiversity, through supporting nature's recovery and new habitats, there'll be an important role there too. It won't obviously have a direct impact on probably some of the waste targets, except insofar as it's possible we will be having targets on things like, food waste, and obviously there'll be a bit of an overlap there. So the answer is the new agriculture policy will have quite a role to play in making sure that we can, reverse some of the damaging trends of the last 30, 40 years with that very different approach to policy, and actually secure the targets that we're setting out under the Environment Bill.
Okay, I've got a follow-up question from Kira Box of Friends of the Earth about you mentioned earlier that the ECJ cases fall away when the transition period ends. At least that's our understanding. Her question, Kira Box's question, Friends of the Earth, is what with those communities with ongoing infringement cases at the EU level, do they need to restart those cases with the OEP, or how does that, if they've got legitimate infringement concerns, how does that carry on?
Well, I guess yes. The answer is that from the from the end of this year, the jurisdiction of the ECJ ends, and so it won't be for the ECJ to pass comment on UK law at that point. So the remedies would be, and this is why the Environment Bill sets this out. We think a sensible governance architecture in future is to have the OEP that people can register their complaints with and concerns with and raise objections through, and for the OEP to investigate those complaints. And so that's the model we envisage in future. But there's no obligation on people to go to the OEP. It will always, of course, be open to individuals or organisations should they want to use judicial review procedures where that's appropriate, and where that where that's got where there's a cause of action under JR to be able to do so.
Thank you. So I've got another question. We've only got about 5 more minutes. I'll try and get through these last questions. A question from Jacob Wallace. So could the Secretary of State share any insights into Defra's work on reducing water consumption, and when may we see a response to the consultation? Could he share his thoughts on how it aligns the Environment Bill and the Planning White Paper?
Yes, so there's, there are two things I'd say. First of all, on water supply, we did publish a new policy on flood management earlier in the summer. And one of the elements there was to look at having a much more holistic approach to, managing excess rainfall, typically in the west of the country, with water scarcity and abstraction problems in the east, and looking at whether we could actually put in place infrastructure that would enable us to perhaps move water west to east to help deal with that current imbalance that we have. So that's one area that we're looking at. But we are also working on a piece of work alongside that that looks at two areas. One is sort of perennial problem of trying to address water leakage from water companies within the network, whether more can be done to address that loss of water, but also alongside that as well, other things that could be done through the planning system, through building regs, to ensure that we have more water efficient appliances within the home. And that is an area that we are looking at, and we'll be doing a consultation on shortly.
We've just got a question in from Adam Deister of the National Trust. Both the 25-year Environment Plan and the Agriculture Bill recognise the importance of the historic environment and its interconnection with the natural environment. It is, however, excluded in the Environment Bill. Has the Secretary of State considered this contradiction and potential negative impact, so including the historic environment in the Environment Bill? This is a National Trust question. Obviously, they have huge historic environment.
Yes, I mean, look, there's always been, an overlap in some elements of agriculture policy with policy areas that are really for DCMS. And so, when it comes to scheduled monuments, but also the other acronym, I think it's called HINIMS, which is the sort of one just short of a scheduled monument, but which is nevertheless a sort of historic architectural feature that gets some protection. So we do have a role for that. The Agriculture Bill you know, does make reference to, I think it makes reference to heritage assets and public access, and there's a sort of neat correlation with some of these things. But it is fundamentally, this is a particular area of policy that's for DCMS, and so while there's an overlap, it's one that they rightly lead on.
Thank you. There's a plea from Richard Benwell, who asked a question earlier about the targets, just saying that there's under the current proposals for targets, there's no target for the extent and condition of important habitats outside protected areas, 92% of the country, which you mentioned earlier, no target for marine species recovery, no target for water quality outcomes, rather. Can the Secretary of State look again at those areas? What's the, I don't expect you to commit yourself on precise targets here on the call, but what's the process going forwards with the targets, and how will you get input from civil society?
Yes, I mean, as I alluded to earlier, I'm very much of the view that the targets shouldn't just, lights going off here, shouldn't just capture what happens in, this is proof that Defra is very energy efficient and that it shuts the lights out on me periodically. The targets shouldn't just capture what happens in protected sites, because yes, we want to see those get obviously into favourable condition, and I think it's undoubtedly the case that would be one of those targets. But we also want to see you know, improvements right across the farmed landscape, and it is important that you know, on the marine environment, obviously the Fisheries Bill sets out objectives, and we'll have plans to move quota stocks back to MSY and so forth, but it is these are all things that that I want to consider, because I want us to be able to capture you know, the impacts of all of our policy measures that we're going to bring to bear, but also not to get into that problem of only measuring things in you know, parts of the country or in certain sites, because then I think you're not doing our natural environment justice. I think if we want to reverse trends for nature, it needs that combination of concerted, intense action in some of those protected sites, but also you know, change in culture, change in farm husbandry, right across the farmed landscape. We will never improve you know, water quality if we just have targeted action in a few pockets around the country. You have to do it holistically right across the landscape. So there is a very important role for having both targets and policies that address intensive action within protected sites, but also action outside them.
Okay, thank you very much. It's 6 o'clock, and I know you have to go. We're going to release you to your other diary commitments. Thank you very much for your time tonight, and thank you everyone for coming for a really interesting session and lots of engaged questions. We've got the next event on the for the APPG on the 18th of November about biodiversity, and then we've got one on electric vehicles and phasing out the internal combustion engine after that. Thank you all for attending. As I said at the beginning, there will be this was recorded, and there will be access to the recording on our website if you want to look at things afterwards. But in the meantime, thank you all very much and enjoy lockdown. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, George.